How did Canada miss the early warning signs of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially after our successful containment of SARS and H1N1? Intelligence experts are sounding the alarm, saying there was no excuse for the failure, and our government needs to learn from this valuable lesson. Professor Wesley Wark is a specialist in international affairs and intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, after a pneumonic plague hit India, Canada developed the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, which was essentially a medical Amber Alert system. It was designed to detect pandemics, and yet it took our government until March 16th, 2020, last year, to increase the risk level in this country. Why did this happen, Professor Wark?
Well, that's a good question. It's an important question. I don't think we have all the answers yet. We just know that something terribly wrong occurred. We should have had much better, much earlier warning about the devastation that COVID was going to bring to our shores. And the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, which you mentioned, was a very specific and unique instrument that was supposed to contribute to that. It was really quite unique in the world. It was developed by Canada in the late 1990s. It was the only state-supported kind of early warning system that used what's called open source intelligence, or basically media scanning, to look for sudden items of news around the world from various forms of media that might indicate that something unusual was going on in that part of the country, that perhaps the government authorities in that country weren't yet alert to or weren't prepared to talk about more globally. So it was meant to be an important part of an early warning system. But the Global Public Health Intelligence Network had been downgraded by our Public Health Agency of Canada. Some of the ways in which it was meant to function had ceased before COVID struck. And in addition to that, even to the extent that it was working, the real problem we faced in Canada was that even though we had some sources of information from the WHO, from China, from allies, from our own sources about the nature of COVID, we were not able to put that information together in such a way that we could generate what are called threat assessments or risk assessments that would say, here's the nature of the risk, here's how serious it is, and we have to start taking precautions in response. Basically, from early January 2020, when news of COVID began to circulate globally, down to the middle of March 2020, that's a 3.5 month period, we did not essentially clue in to the risk posed by COVID-19. And that was a terrible failure. I call it a failure of intelligence, because I think that's what it was.
You say that all they needed to do was rely on intelligence and satellite imagery to see what was happening in China. It was as simple as that if we weren't going to rely on the Global Public Health Intelligence Network.
So I don't want to make it sound too simple.
Yeah.
The problem might have been complex. The problem we had was that we didn't, throw all the available tools that we had at that problem. We didn't use the Global Public Health Intelligence Network well. We didn't use information from our allies well. We didn't turn our own intelligence gathering capabilities to that problem. And what ultimately you really need is a combination of different kinds of sources. We don't have our own kind of signals intelligence or spy satellites up there in the sky, but our allies do, and they share that product with us. If we had taken this as a serious intelligence problem at the outset, we could have thrown all kinds of resources at it to get at the heart of the problem in ways that the Chinese government, certainly in the early weeks of the outbreak, were not really prepared to tell the world the full story of.
What do you think could have happened if Canada had acted sooner?
Well, all kinds of cascading responses should have taken place. The two key things that I think, perhaps three, come to mind, and very quickly. One is that we could have moved much sooner to really to stop travel into Canada, to erect strong walls at the border. We're still working at that, as your listeners will know. Secondly, we could have taken measures to prepare ourselves for the arrival of COVID, including enhancing our stockpile capacity, which was at a pretty low ebb in the early months of COVID-19. And the third and important thing is that the government, if it had believed in the threat itself and had the sources of information available to it to convince itself of the threat, could also have communicated much earlier with the Canadian public to say, not to worry people or throw people into a panic, but to say this is the reality of what's coming. These are the kinds of measures that we need to start taking. So all of those social distancing, social hygiene measures, border closures, better public communications, better understanding of the threat, all of that could have happened much earlier than it did in Canada.
So what kind of shape do you think we're in now as a country, and what have we learned from this valuable lesson?
I think we're still in the midst of trying to learn lessons, and the problem is we keep being overwhelmed by waves of COVID-19, which we should have expected and didn't clearly. So we're in the second wave. There's great fear there'll be a third wave as new variants take hold. So sooner or later, learning lessons has to catch up with the present. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think the federal government's view was that they would wait out COVID and then learn lessons from it for the next one that they hope would be many years down the road. That's really not the reality of global pandemics anymore. They can come anytime from anywhere at any kind of speed and velocity and threat. And so we should be learning lessons now, but I think we're so immersed in the kind of day-to-day effort to deal with the crisis that there hasn't been a whole lot of opportunity to do that yet.
All right, Professor Wesley Wark, thank you so much for your time today.